Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of What the Art History. Today, we will be talking about the accidental Renaissance. So, before we cover accidental Renaissance, we need to ask, what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance refers to a time period in Europe from 14th to the 17th centuries. And the word itself, Renaissance, is French and it means rebirth. And the reason why the Renaissance is referred to as this kind of rebirth is because it was a really massive cultural, artistic, scientific, and religious, societal moment of change. There were a lot of innovations happening. There were a lot of great discoveries happening. There were new inventions occurring, as well as these advances in artistic techniques that were occurring as well. So following the Middle Ages, there was an interest in the classics, so ancient Rome and ancient Greece, as well as this new philosophy called humanism. And humanism refers to the human experience, naturalism, individualism. And so there was this new philosophy that was occurring at this moment, along with all of these societal changes that were happening. So some notable people in this time period include Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and some other artists include Botticelli, Donatello, El Greco, and Titian, among many others. So some patrons of the arts include the Medici family, who were a merchant and banker family that were incredibly affluent. They had a lot of political power as well as money, so they were incredibly wealthy. So they invested a lot of money into the arts. And the Renaissance art isn't just contained to paintings and frescoes and sculptures, but there was also a lot of advances in architecture. So they commissioned art as well as buildings themselves. And they did this to kind of like flex their wealth and their status. So another major patron of the arts at the time was actually the Catholic Church. So if you know the Sistine Chapel, that is a very notable project that was commissioned by the Catholic Church. And some popes that kind of started this include Pope Julius II. He commissioned Michelangelo and Raphael. Notably, he also commissioned the Sistine Chapel. And his successors continued this commission of the arts. So Pope Leo X, he commissioned Raphael. Pope Clement VII commissioned Michelangelo, and then Pope Paul III commissioned Michelangelo as well as Titian. So what are some features of art? When you're looking at a Renaissance piece, how do we know that it's Renaissance? And that's a really great question. So Renaissance art has some really notable features, and these features include this pursuit of realism, but also idealized beauty. So there was this new advance in mathematics that allowed for an advance in art, which is linear perspective. And this allowed for more centralized figures that were proportional. There was also this investment in understanding anatomy better, so calculating the perfect proportions. If you know, like that Leonardo da Vinci picture, that's him studying math and using it on the human body. And linear perspective was also really helpful because it allowed for these third dimensional images. These aren't flat pictures. And so when you compare Renaissance art to its precursor, medieval art, you're going to notice that there's a total shift from these really flat images to these three-dimensional images that use lighting, shading, as well as math and placement. And the figures themselves are realistic. They're very beautiful, but they are realistic. They, even though it's idealized beauty, they are what people look like, if that makes sense. You aren't having a medieval cat in a Renaissance painting. You're not going to have a medieval cat. You're going to have a cat in the painting, a beautiful cat, but a cat. And so there was this naturalist and realistic figures that were occurring. And this included chiaroscuro, which is an artistic technique of using contrast between light and shadow to create depth. So another notable feature with Renaissance art is this emphasis on balance and symmetry. So these are going to be really proportional, specific compositions. You're going to have a clear divided into threes. So there's kind of like a grid that you could see in Renaissance pictures. And you're going to have, these 3 horizontal lines and these 3 vertical lines. And this comes from using linear perspective itself, which relied on this kind of grid to help create the center and ensure that everything was mathematically logical. But it also related to these values that were happening at the time where you wanted these really balanced images. And so this also helped with these ideas of harmony and order. So that this value kind of emphasized, okay, we want these pictures to be really balanced. We want them to be symmetrical. And so you can tell that a lot when you're looking at Renaissance paintings, is they're very proportional, they're very balanced, they're organized, it's very intentional, it's very beautiful. There's lighting, there's shadowing, everything looks 3-dimensional. So that's kind of like how you can tell a Renaissance painting. So math and science were used in creating these images. So mathematical principles helped establish linear perspective, as well as the calculations for bodily, anatomy and everything making sense. And from that, there was this emphasis on order and harmony. So themes themselves in Renaissance paintings are mostly religious. So this is partially because the Catholic Church was a major patron at the time, so they were commissioning a lot of art from a lot of different artists. So of course they're going to commission religious pictures. But this also happens to be because of the time period itself. So religion at the time was incredibly integral in life. There wasn't really this idea of separation of church and state that we have now. Kind of religion was just an accepted everyday part of life. And the Medici family themselves were religious. And so this also is the reason why we have a lot of religious art. And they sought to reflect their power and status through art. And finally, itself, humanism, that philosophy that I was talking about earlier, and this interest in nature also came partially from the really influential works of St. Francis of Assisi. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a Renaissance piece. So this is a really famous Renaissance fresco. So fresco is basically a painting on a wall. So this is a really famous Renaissance fresco. This is from Raphael, and this is the School of Athens. It was painted between 1509 to 1511, and it is located in Vatican City. So in the room itself where the School of Athens is, it's a 4-walled room. And so on each wall, there's a different theme that's being portrayed. So on one wall, there's poetry, and on the opposite wall, there's justice. On the other 2 longer walls, we have the depiction of philosophy and theology. So this is a really orderly, specific room that in itself contains the art. So this is just one of 4 pieces in this room. So when we look at this picture itself, we can really see a lot of Renaissance ideas sprung to life. So first of all, we see this reconciliation of ancient thought and Christian theology from having the philosophy piece face the theology piece. And when you examine these 2 pictures together, they kind of complete themselves. So the blank places that you see in the School of Athens, notably above all the figures, is actually filled in by the corresponding theology piece. So that's like a really cool thing too. But the figures themselves are these ancient philosophers. Plato and Aristotle are centered in this painting. We also see a lot of other very famous ancient philosophers. So this again ties to that Renaissance theme of antiquity, this revival of the classics and antiquity. And we can also see that this is a painting that has a very clear split in the middle. So yes, Aristotle and Plato are the central figures, but if you see, there's a left side and a right side to this picture. So, and it's kind of guided as well by the archway that goes through the middle of the composition. And then on both sides, it is hugged by these statues of gods. So the gods themselves that you see on the right, we have Minerva, and her Greek equivalent is Athena. And then on the left, we have Apollo. So there are classical philosophers, there are ancient gods, and you might be wondering, well, why is this in the Pope's bedroom, basically. Like, why is this in the Pope's chambers? Well, because philosophy really is integral, and it is really reflective of the human experience. And we're going back to this idea of humanism. So philosophy really allows for understanding the human experience, and it really questions and goes through that thought process. So religion itself is fairly philosophy, has a lot of philosophy. A lot of Christian theology was informed by philosophy and has philosophy incorporated into it. We can also see that where Plato stands is other Platonic philosophers, and on Aristotle's, there's a lot of Aristotelian figures as well. So we can also see that these are really three-dimensional images. These are really proportional bodies. There's nobody's who looks a little deformed or anything. Everybody looks real. They certainly look very idealized, but they look very real. The location itself is really notable. We're kind of like in the heavens, it kind of seems like. We're in this like very heavenly space, this beautiful space where we have all of these great minds all, congregating together. So we can see very clearly that this is a Renaissance painting. So now let's move on to accidental Renaissance. Now that we know the Renaissance, we're ready to talk about accidental Renaissance. So what is accidental Renaissance? Accidental Renaissance refers to candid photographs that seemingly depict Renaissance paintings come to life. So these images are really dramatic, they're captivating, and in some cases, there's almost like religious connotations to them. Like perhaps there's a framing effect that gives somebody a halo. And a lot of these images really come down to lighting, framing, composition, as well as the subject matter. So, what's the issue? This is accidental Renaissance. This is great. A lot of these accidental Renaissance pictures aren't really Renaissance, they're actually Baroque. So, before we talk about Baroque, let's take a look at a true accidental Renaissance photograph. Here we have it. This has been dubbed online the Passion of the Crews. So, really similar right away to the School of Athens, we have this central archway. We have a central figure in the middle. The gold behind him kind of functions like a halo. So it kind of really centralizes Ted Cruz in this picture. The framing as well, you have all these figures going toward Ted Cruz. There's this captivation. There's also kind of like this, Ted Cruz doesn't look at the picture. He doesn't look at the photograph. He doesn't look at the camera. He looks beyond. So this kind of goes again to this pensive kind of philosophical state that a lot of these Renaissance pictures, paintings, a lot of these Renaissance paintings and art really discuss philosophy, theology. There is something inherently a little bit religious with this picture, which you can tell from the halo effect that I described earlier. But this is a really balanced picture as well. The top half of this photograph is really empty, so it corresponds with this harmony, and then it's contrasted on the bottom with all these figures. So this is a really balanced picture. It's very clearly, you can split this picture into a 3x3 grid, and it's not super dramatic. So another thing with Renaissance paintings is they are dynamic pictures, but they're kind of like stills in a sense. Like when we're looking at the School of Athens, we know that there are people discussing, but the way that the painting is framed is it's kind of like we're getting a snapshot. So that's really important to discuss. So now that we know, okay, Ted Cruz, the Passion of the Cruz, this is very clearly Renaissance. We can tell. There's also this interest in proportion. So there's a lot of body parts that are included. There's a lot of hands. Hands are really big in Renaissance pictures as well. I mean, once you know how to draw hands, you're including them wherever you can. So now let's talk about Baroque. What is Baroque? So Baroque refers to the 17th century in Europe. And the context of why Baroque is Baroque kind of happened after the Reformation. So the Catholic Church and Protestantism was founded. So there's a lot of religious conflict. And so from that, art evolved to be really greater and more dramatic and sought to evoke stronger emotional reactions from individuals. So a lot of these pictures are religious, and it made this religious imagery more accessible and more dramatic to kind of create this and emphasize this amazement of God and the divine. So features of Baroque art, it's really complex art that seeks to um, establish emotional states from the viewer with these really dramatic and these expressive scenes. They're really grandiose, they're dramatic, they're tense, they're emotional, they're dynamic, and they're moving scenes. So a lot of these images have these really high contrast in lighting and color. And Baroque itself was actually criticized because it went against the standards of art that were established in the Renaissance. And so there was this diversion to create these more rich, these more colorful, and these more contrasting images. So let's take a look at a Baroque painting. So this is Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. So again, we're still really religious, but you can tell that this image is a lot different from Renaissance. So it's darker. There's this contrast of light. Light is really important in Baroque. It's a really dark image, and we have this halo above Christ that you can very faintly see. And then you have the light streaming in from the window that really highlights Matthew himself as the figure. And so there is this emphasis on realism. There's a lot of contrasting and shading. And even though Jesus himself is in this painting, he's not the central figure. The central figure is actually Matthew. And so what's really interesting too is that this kind of differs from Renaissance because this scene is a moving scene. You can tell that it almost looks like everybody's going to continue with what they're doing here. It's not like kind of a snapshot. It's a really dynamic painting with the framing of the figures, the way the figures are painted, the way that the lighting moves. And there's this new lighting technique called tenebrism. And tenebrism refers to like these abrupt and sudden changes with illuminated figures and shadowed figures, and kind of like this idea of using light to tell a story. So in this painting, we can see that the light guides the viewer to Matthew, and it really highlights Matthew as the figure in this painting. And you can also tell there's a lot of richness and color. And then the center figures, while this is technically still balanced, it's not as balanced as Renaissance. You know, you have that window there that maybe if this were a Renaissance piece, that window would be in the center. Matthew would be a little bit more to the right. Jesus would be centered with Matthew, so it'd be more like Jesus and Matthew together rather than Jesus being on the side, pointing at Matthew. This is a really Baroque image. And so with that, now that we kind of see that Baroqueness, we're going to look at an accidental Renaissance. It's not accidental Renaissance, it's actually accidental Baroque. And this is a horse rears in the crowd. So right away, there is this dramatic contrast in lighting. The horse itself is highlighted through the light, and the way that the arms, they kind of function at centering this horse. And then in the background, you see these people just kind of disinterested. They aren't even looking at the scene. And this image, the way that the horse is rearing, this is a really moving picture. You know that the horse is going up and it's going to go back down. You aren't looking at it going, oh, well, I don't really know where everybody's going to go. No, we know the horse is going to go back down. You know, like this is really intense. This is a really emotional picture too. It's very tense. There's the contrast with the lighting. There's also these really rich colors coming from the clothing of the people themselves. The horse itself, with its I don't know horse terminology at all, with its horse clothes, that's what we're gonna call it, horse clothes. With its horse clothes, that's so ridiculous. But with its horse clothes, as well, that also really functions with emphasizing this color. And this picture is really dramatic. It's really expressive. It's very dynamic. It's a moving picture. You know what's going to happen after this. Everything's in movement. It's not taken while the horse was walking. It's taken when the horse was rearing. So there's really dramatic scene. It's really expressive. The hands themselves kind of read as like this desperation, as these people are desperately trying to, stop this horse from freaking out. So that's kind of where you get that dramatic effect as well. So I hope this helped with understanding accidental Renaissance. Now that you know this, we can talk about the fact that accidental Renaissance is a really interesting phenomenon online. It's a really fun engagement with art history. But now we know a lot of these accidental Renaissance pictures aren't really Renaissance, but a lot of them are Baroque. So I hope that now that you know this, you can peruse the Reddit for accidental Renaissance and be horrified at the amount of Baroque pictures occurring there, falsely being described as Renaissance. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and see you next time.